on gender and racial bias in leadership. I want to first start by saying for the last 5 years, I've been teaching this course, and one of the objectives of the course is to discuss power dynamics and the gender gap in leadership. And so I have been focusing on that over the last 5 years, looking at the challenges women face in advancing into leadership positions in healthcare specifically and in other fields as well. And it really did not hit me until this summer that I was really limited in how I was teaching this content because the studies that I was sharing and the research statistics and all the information I was communicating out to students was really focused on the challenges white women face. And we really weren't addressing the specific barriers that women of color that face in this country very particularly. That is not to say that men of color don't face their own specific challenges, and I'll touch on that very briefly. And it's not to say that white men who do make up a minority in nursing don't face challenges. But as we go through the statistics and the research, it is very clear that the most disadvantaged group of people in leadership positions are women of color. And followed then by men of color, and then followed by women, and then white men who hold the majority of positions of leadership in really every industry in the country and in many other countries as well. So I think it's really important for me to be honest and open about the fact that we are going to be specifically focusing on women and women of color in this conversation. And I think that is important because it is a very underrepresented group in leadership. We will touch on some of the other challenges faced by other groups as well. I also want to start off by saying I love having this class in person because I think the discussions that you have in your groups and with each other are so important. And we're not doing a discussion board this week because we're having our class or online. And I really want you to focus on this reflection that I'm having you do that is really about intercultural responsiveness. And so that's the assignment that's going to, and I'll talk about this at the end of the presentation. But so there's not as much chance to really discuss this. We will get some time on Friday before our panel to have a little bit of a discussion, but I really do hope that you take time this week to reflect on the questions that are raised at the end of this PowerPoint and think about the questions that are raised for your assignment that you'll be turning in at the end of week 6, and really just reflect on your own personal biases. We'll talk about how bias plays a part in some of the challenges that women and women of color face. And so I think it's helpful for us all to do an individual exercise of really reflecting on what biases do we hold that may be adding to stereotypes and potential the potential for discrimination or prejudice against women and women of color in leadership roles. So the first thing to really look at are the numbers, because we have come a long way. And students always point that out to me, that women have much more opportunities than we did 50, 100 years ago. But we still have a long ways to go, as these numbers indicate. So this is from a 2019 report. And there's a link to the full PDF if you want to see. There's a lot of really good information in there. But if you look at the very last column here, under C-suite, these would be CEO positions. So the CFOs, the chief financial officers, the chief organizational officers, the chief executive officer, anyone in a chief position. And then the next line is your senior vice presidents, your senior leadership, and then vice president, and then managers and directors, senior managers, directors, managers, and then entry-level folks. So you'll see that white men make up only 35% of entry-level positions. They make up 68% of C-suite level positions. I think the statistics that we're going to be focusing on here are white women and women of color, and also men of color is important to also point out. So you'll see at the C-suite level position, only 4% are women of color, only 5% then at the senior vice president, and then 7% at vice president. And it's really important because the decisions that are made within organizations are typically made at the C-suite and vice president level. So what that means is that the majority, the vast majority, over 95% of the people making decisions, there is no representation of a woman of color making involved in that decision making process. And that's why we'll talk a little bit about disparities next week, but the result of, in healthcare particularly, of not having women of color at the table is that then we do see a lot of health disparities of women of color. And some of that can be traced back to the fact that they are not represented in the decision making process. So one great example of that is the Black maternal health Black maternal mortality rates. So Black women are much more likely to have complications during labor and delivery. They are much more likely to die in childbirth than white women, and they're more likely to suffer lots of other complications as well. And some of that, we could talk at length about why that is, but one potential reason is that people who are making decisions about how labor and delivery rooms operate, how faculty or how nurses are trained, how doctors and OBGYN are trained. They aren't trained by women of color, and those women of color aren't in positions of making decisions about policy and procedures. So that just is a one example of how it matters who's at the table. But it also you'll see throughout the entire slides or at every level that white women are also underrepresented. And then again, you'll also see that men of color are underrepresented. We have very clearly 68%, more than 2/3 of our C-suite and senior vice presidents are white men. And you can see that we have seen a change from 2015 to 2019. There has been an increase of both women and slightly women of color at the vice president and senior vice president and C-suite level, but not substantial change. You'll see it's about anywhere between 1 and 4 percentage points. So I think a really important question then, and this is what I want you guys to be really reflecting on, is why does this gap exist? Why are women and women of color not represented in senior level leadership positions? And the articles that you read today, specifically the Livingston article, really highlights that one reason that is because when people think of leaders, they don't think of women, they don't think of female, and that goes to the characteristics that are associated to men and women, and that women are seen as more nurturing and more caring and more their skill set is relegated more towards caring professions like nursing, but also taking care of children, and they're not seen as having the skill set necessary to be a leader. Things like being assertive and ambitious and dominant. And that is that stereotype is one thing or one reason that this gap may exist. Similarly, that women are not viewed as a good fit for leadership positions for some of the same reasons that we mentioned. That their traits don't line up well with what we see as leadership traits. And then I think really importantly that there is this, what Livingston calls the agency penalty or the double bind. And that is this idea that when women do present themselves as assertive and ambitious and have a strong voice and want to be independent and leaders, that they are seen in a negative light. And many of you have probably heard many words associated with women who are acting in that way. We have a very negative swear word that starts with a B that is associated with women who act in that way. Another word that's often used is bossy, which has a very negative connotation. But they're seen as really cold hearted and suspicious and power grabbing and not well liked, not well received, and both by men and women. Women in particular sometimes have really negative views of women who are assertive. And so that is the double bind, is those are the traits that are seen as you need to have in order to be a leader. But then when women try to demonstrate those traits or those skills, they are seen as questionable and shady and not to be trusted and too domineering and too aggressive, and often are not promoted then into those roles. There are some other specific challenges or reasons that may exist for why Black women or women of color, though that those reasons apply to really all women, but for Black women in particular, um, they don't have the same stereotype. Some Black women are seen as strong and independent, and that can actually be in their favor. However, they are penalized by the research that Livingston did, penalized for ambitious agency, which means wanting to be in a leadership role and wanting to have power and wanting to have decision making power. That is seen as a direct threat to the hierarchy, particularly of white men. And so they can be penalized for having that ambition. But of course, that ambition is required in order to pursue a leadership position. So again, they face a slightly different double bind. They also are disproportionately penalized for making mistakes on the job. So really, and this is where you'll hear from individuals, both in the research and anecdotally, that Black women and other people of color and Black men as well, and to some extent white women, really can't make any mistakes. That they have to work harder and be better and be on their game all the time, because they are penalized more negatively when they make a mistake than a white male who maybe makes the same mistake. And so that also prevents them from, because we are all human and we're all going to make mistakes. So that belief that if a woman makes a mistake, especially a Black woman makes a mistake, then that really means they're unqualified, and that pushes them out for the potential for promotions. Whereas when men make mistakes, they aren't penalized as harshly. And then lastly, Dishman, the article from the Fast Company magazine, talked about hostile work environments, negative stereotypes, and bias. That those are some of the main reasons why women are kept out of top leadership positions. And we'll talk a little bit more about bias. I also think it's important to recognize some of the myths or some of the reasons why people have said that there's a gap, and demonstrate how the research shows that that is really not the case. So it's really not a pipeline problem, because women make up over 55% of the workforce. So a lot of times people will say, well, there's just not women who are qualified to be in these management roles. However, we know that women are entering into the workforce at at a higher percentage than men, and so they are working in the fields and would be eligible then for a promotion. Women also earn more college degrees, and now have just recently moved into even earning more degrees in fields like law, medicine, and other advanced degrees. Women out earn master's degrees over men, and are making a lot of strides in the fields, in other PhD fields as well. We also know that when scored on objective assessments regarding men and women's ability to drive business, so be able to attract and maintain business, whether that be in sales or in client withholding or keeping clients, that they score similarly on those types of assessments. And then one thing that I